Okay, this YouTube video is going to talk you through the brain structure and its impact upon aggression. You need to be able to outline the assumptions of the biological approach, list the 4 brain lobes and understand what they control. It's worth noticing that last exam question made you identify and label the brain lobes on the picture of the brain. Okay, just to recap then, in biological psychology, the assumptions of the approach. The first one is that behaviour can be explained with the reference to specific structures in the brain. The next one is that aspects of behaviour can be explained by the action of neurotransmitters. And the third one is that behaviour can be explained with reference to human evolutionary history. It's important that you remember some basic facts here. The brain has 2 halves that we refer to as hemispheres, and this process is called lateralization. Now, when we're referring to bilateral, we're talking about 2 sides, and if we're talking unilaterally, we're referring to 1 side. A quick historical overview. Now, early humans understood basic qualities of the brain, such as using trepanning to treat migraines or epilepsy. And if you look at the green box on the screen, you can see that trepanning is a surgical intervention in which a hole is drilled into the skull to treat problems related to the surface of the brain. Phrenology, introduced in the 19th century, is where they told someone their character by mapping bumps on their head. Just a little bit of interest for you there. And Phineas Gage in 1848 was one of the first cases of this. Now, Phineas Gage had an accident which meant that an iron rod went all the way through his brain, through his prefrontal cortex. Now, Phineas Gage before this was said to be a very nice person, very calm, very polite. And after this, he became quite aggressive and he was known as not like Gage. Now, this case led to greater understanding and investigation of the brain structure and its impact upon personality. If you look here, there's a picture of Phineas Gage's brain injury where the pole went through his brain, and then this here is a picture of Phineas Gage afterwards. Now, if you look at a picture of the brain on the screen, we've got 4 lobes to the brain. The first one, as you can see just here, is the frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is obviously at the front of the brain, and that refers to controlling our behaviour, our emotions, problem solving, and decision making. Now, the parietal lobe, which is at the top, now I always tell my students to remember this because your parents raised you, so they're at the top of you, and that's how you remember the parietal lobe. And that's in charge of perception, spelling, and knowledge of numbers. Now, my pupils always talk about the fact that their parents are good at spelling, or one of them's good at maths, and that's how you can remember. The occipital lobe, which is the one that we see just tucked away at the back here, and that's our vision, our colour identification and visual processing. Now, obviously, occipital refers to vision, so that's quite a nice way to remember that, or you go to the opticians for your eyes. And then lastly, your temporal lobe, which is the one here, which is round about your ear. Now, you can always remember that someone takes your temperature often if you go to the doctor in your ear, so you can remember that that's the one on the side. And that's the one that refers to language, facial recognition, hearing, and speech, so another link to your ear. The corpus callosum is the aspect of the brain that's in between the 2 hemispheres, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Now, this corpus callosum links the 2 hemispheres of the brain together, so any messages that are trying to travel between the 2 hemispheres have to cross across the corpus callosum. Now, if this structure is split, it means that an individual can't send messages across the 2 hemispheres, and we refer to that as split brain. Now, this used to be a cause for serious epilepsy, which is quite interesting. Okay, linking what we've just learned about the structure of the brain then to aggression. Now, lesions, which is where we purposely cut, damage, or stimulate an area of the brain, has been shown to activate aggressive behaviour when we're using lab rats or lab animals. For example, the hypothalamus is seen to have a balancing role. Offensive behaviour or physical attack is when the medial hypothalamus is either cut, damaged, or stimulated. Defensive behaviour, again, is linked to the hypothalamus with their response to threat. And predatory aggression as well, which is also linked to the hypothalamus, where we attack another species to gain food. Now, the prefrontal cortex, which is an aspect within our frontal lobe of the brain. Now, cortex refers to an outer layer of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex is literally right behind your forehead, and that's been found to have a link with emotions. Now, the prefrontal cortex has connections with the brain relating to dopamine and serotonin because these relate to emotions. Now, RAIN is your key study within the biological approach anyway. It's actually your classic study. And if you link, these are the findings just here to RAIN study. Now, RAIN found that lower function in the prefrontal cortex led to less thinking through of consequences, and he actually found lower activity in the prefrontal cortex of the brain by murderers who pleaded guilty by reason of insanity. Now, this suggests that the functioning, a low level of functioning here, means that individuals are unable to regulate their behaviour, and thus suggesting a link to aggression. Another study was done by Becara, which is number 1 on the screen here, and they found that when there's damage to the prefrontal cortex, people tend to focus on the present. They're not able to plan for long term. Again, think about consequences. They seek immediate rewards. Now, the prefrontal cortex, as we've discussed, regulates emotions, so damage to this would suggest that someone is unable to contain or to control their aggressive reactions. Now, we've talked slightly about the hypothalamus, but if we look at the limbic system in a little bit more detail, the limbic system is made up of our hippocampus, our amygdala, and our hypothalamus. Now, the hippocampus you will have talked about before in cognitive psychology. But the limbic system is said to control our temperature, our role in self-preservation and survival, and our fight and flight response. And the amygdala, which you can see here, is supposed to be one of the oldest parts of the brain. So as we've talked about, the hippocampus, we know plays a role in memory, converting short-term to long-term memories. The hypothalamus takes a particular role in regulating temperature, hunger, thirst, pain responses, etc. The most important one that you need to talk about when you're referring to aggression is the amygdala. Now, there's supposed to be 2 amygdala on the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, and the evidence is that animal studies show that if the amygdala is stimulated, then the animal will show higher levels of aggression. Animals with no amygdala become passive and unresponsive and don't respond to fear. Now, amygdala has a role in arousal, aggression, and again, this fight or flight response that we're talking about. Now, the amygdala, again, is the center of emotions, so it integrates internal and external stimuli, which causes us to react to the environment, for example, being particularly aggressive. And again, if we stimulate the amygdala using electrical current, there is an aggressive response. And if we remove it, the animal is passive. Now, this here is your evidence for the role of the amygdala in aggression.